Have you ever wondered what happens in the spiritual realm when a woman finally remembers who she is in God? Not who the world told her to be, not who pain shaped her to become, but who God declared her to be before she ever breathed her first breath. There is a moment, subtle yet powerful, when a woman begins to awaken, when her spirit starts to recognize that she was never meant to live small, silent, or wounded. She begins to sense that the emptiness she feels is not weakness, but a holy invitation, an invitation to remember, to rise, to reclaim what life tried to steal. When a woman remembers who she is in God, something shifts. Old labels begin to fall off. Words that once hurt lose their power. The weight she carried for years starts to loosen. She realizes that her identity is not shaped by failure, heartbreak, or comparison, but by divine intention. Her worth is anchored in the one who formed her, called her, and breathed purpose into her. And suddenly, the lies she believed for so long begin to crack. She sees that she was never abandoned, never overlooked, never disqualified. She was being prepared, refined, strengthened for a moment such as this. This awakening is not loud. It is not dramatic. It begins quietly, like a whisper in the heart, a reminder that she is chosen, beloved, and covered. A reminder that God has been with her in every broken chapter, not as a distant observer, but as the one rewriting her story with tenderness and intention. And as this truth settles into her spirit, she begins to walk differently, not perfectly but purposefully, not fearfully but faithfully, because identity births confidence, and confidence births movement. Maybe you have felt this stirring. Maybe you have sensed that something inside you is shifting, calling you back to who you were created to be. If so, pause and acknowledge it. This is not random, this is alignment. This is God pulling you back into the identity heaven always recognized, even when you forgot it on earth. And as we move deeper into this message, I want you to stay open, because what God is awakening in you now may shape every step ahead. Before we continue, take a moment to reflect on what resonated with you. Share your experience in the comments. Leave a like if this message is speaking to your heart, and make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the rest of this journey. What you are about to discover may bring even more clarity as we move forward, allowing this awakening to grow stronger and more alive within you. When a woman begins to remember who she is in God, something else happens beneath the surface that most people never notice. The identity she is rediscovering starts confronting the invisible marks life has left on her. These marks are not scars on the skin, but impressions on the soul, formed through words spoken over her, environments she adapted to, and expectations she silently carried for years. They show up as doubt, comparison, overthinking, fear of disappointing others, or believing she must earn love to deserve it. These invisible weights shape how she sees herself long before she ever learns to question them. Many women grow up hearing messages that subtly chip away at their worth. Some were told to stay quiet, so they silenced their voice. Others were told they were too emotional, too intense, too ambitious, too much of something that was actually divinely designed. Others learned to shrink themselves to keep peace or to survive environments that did not nurture who they truly were. Without noticing, they began living from these distortions instead of living from truth. And even as adults, these marks continue to whisper lies that feel familiar, convincing them that they are less than what God has spoken. But when God begins awakening identity, these old narratives start losing their grip. He gently exposes them, not to shame her, but to free her. He reveals how much of her life was influenced by wounds she never deserved, by burdens she was never called to carry, by labels that were never hers. And in this revelation, something powerful happens. She starts recognizing the difference between who she became for survival and who she truly is in God. This awareness is not always comfortable. In fact, it often brings emotions she tried to bury. Yet, it is in this very unraveling that healing begins. As she walks through this inner awakening, she realizes the world never had the authority to define her. The opinions that shaped her identity were temporary, but the identity God gave her is eternal. The lies that once felt like truth begin to dissolve under the weight of divine clarity. She starts remembering the strength she forgot she had, the courage that was buried under fear, the calling she once sensed but pushed aside, the voice she silenced to fit where she was never meant to stay. And with every layer God lifts, she takes another step toward her true self. The self, heaven, always recognized. This process is sacred because it restores her vision. She begins to see herself the way God sees her, which changes everything about how she moves, speaks, and thinks. And as this clarity deepens, she discovers that she is not simply healing from the past. She is being reintroduced to the woman she was always meant to become. A woman who is rising with quiet strength and deep spiritual awareness, ready to step into the fullness of her identity as God continues unfolding what comes next. As a woman continues awakening to who she truly is in God, a deeper shift begins to unfold within her mind and spirit. The old lies that once shaped her start to collide with a new clarity rising inside her. And this inner collision creates a moment of revelation that feels both unsettling and liberating. It is the moment when she begins to see that much of what she believed about herself was inherited, absorbed, or imposed, not chosen. And when truth and deception stand face to face, something powerful happens. The chains that once felt unbreakable begin to loosen. This awakening of spiritual consciousness does not happen all at once. It comes in waves, gentle yet persistent, urging her to question the narratives that kept her small. She begins to realize that the thoughts she repeated for years were never hers to begin with. The fear that told her she was unworthy, the insecurity that said she was replaceable, the doubt that whispered she was not enough. These voices were echoes of wounds, not reflections of her identity. And slowly, God begins to expose the difference. He shows her how these internal battles were never signs of weakness, but signs of misalignment, signals pointing her back toward His truth. In this process, she discovers that spiritual awakening is not about becoming someone new. It is about remembering someone ancient, someone designed before the world tried to shape her. God begins to highlight moments in her life where she felt glimpses of that truth, a season when she felt bold, a moment when she sensed purpose, a time when she felt undeniably seen by God. These memories become reminders, guiding her back to the woman she truly is. And with each reminder, her confidence grows not from self-promotion, but from spiritual recognition. This breaking of internal lies also brings a surprising emotional clarity. She begins to understand why certain relationships drained her, why certain environments silenced her, why she felt misplaced in rooms where others seemed comfortable. Her spirit was reacting to misalignment long before her mind understood it. When she recognizes this, she no longer blames herself for what didn't fit. Instead, she starts to bless the misalignment for revealing what was never meant to shape her identity. And as this consciousness expands, something beautiful happens. She becomes more aware of God's presence in the small, quiet spaces of her life. The moments she once overlooked now feel intentional. The silence she once feared now feels sacred. The stillness she avoided becomes a space where she hears God more clearly than ever before. She begins to see that God was never absent, only waiting for the noise inside her to quiet enough for truth to be heard. And this truth continues guiding her forward, preparing her for an even deeper revelation about who she is and who she is becoming as the journey unfolds. As this awakening deepens, a woman begins to notice something she had forgotten how to recognize, the gentle, unmistakable whisper of God speaking value over her life. It does not arrive as a shout or a dramatic sign. It comes quietly, like a truth she somehow always knew, yet never fully embraced. This whisper begins to rebuild what life tried to break. It reminds her that her worth was never negotiable, never dependent on someone else's approval, never attached to performance, beauty, or perfection. It was established long before she experienced disappointment, heartbreak, or rejection. And as this realization settles into her heart, she starts to breathe differently. A new sense of dignity rises within her, not born from pride, but from spiritual recognition. God does not restore identity the way the world does. The world demands proof. God simply speaks, and when he speaks, his words begin to undo years of internal damage. He reminds her that she is seen when she feels invisible. He calls her strong when she feels exhausted. He calls her chosen when she feels overlooked. These truths begin to reshape the foundation of her inner world, slowly replacing insecurity with confidence, shame with grace, and fear with quiet authority. It is a rebuilding that happens from the inside out, transforming not just how she sees herself, but how she carries herself in every space she enters. She begins to recognize moments where God was already nurturing her spirit long before she realized it. The peace she felt in the middle of chaos, the strength that rose when she thought she had none left, the clarity that came in moments of confusion. These were not coincidences. They were reminders of a God who never stopped affirming her worth, even when she struggled to believe in it herself. And now, as she spiritually reconnects with this truth, she becomes more aware of how intentionally God has been guiding her through every season. Her heart starts to heal as she understands that God never saw her through the lens of her mistakes or past experiences. He saw her through the lens of who he created her to be, and as this realization grows, the woman inside her begins to rise with a softness and strength that coexist beautifully. She is not trying to prove anything anymore. She is remembering, she is returning, she is standing in the identity that was always hers. If something in this awakening resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Your experience might be the reminder another woman needs as she begins to remember who she is in God. As a woman continues to rediscover her identity in God, something remarkable begins to unfold, the awakening of her purpose. It does not arrive as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual unveiling, like layers being lifted from her spirit one by one. She starts to sense that her life was never meant to be random, reactive, or defined by the circumstances she survived. There is intention woven into her existence, a divine blueprint written long before she ever questioned her worth. And as she leans into this awareness, the idea of purpose shifts from a distant concept to something she can feel stirring inside her. Purpose is not always loud. Sometimes it begins as a longing she cannot explain, a desire she cannot ignore, a direction she feels pulled toward even without understanding why. God begins reminding her of gifts she buried, passions she quieted, dreams she set aside because life demanded she be strong instead of expressive, responsible, instead of visionary, guarded instead of trusting. But now, as identity is restored, those forgotten parts of her begin rising to the surface again, signaling that they were never lost, only waiting. She begins to realize that purpose is not defined by achievement or perfection. It is shaped by alignment. It flows from knowing who she is and whose she is. When she remembers that she is chosen, equipped, and deeply loved, she starts to walk with a confidence that opens doors she once assumed were locked. Her decisions shift, her mindset strengthens, her spiritual vision sharpens. She begins to recognize opportunities not as coincidences, but as divine invitations guiding her into the life God always intended for her. This clarity also helps her understand the seasons she once resented. Moments of delay, disappointment, or isolation begin to make sense, not because they were pleasant, but because they shaped the woman she needed to become. Purpose demands preparation, and preparation often hides within pain, stretching her, refining her, and revealing strength she never knew she had. What once felt like detours now look like positioning. What once felt like loss now looks like training. As she steps deeper into this revelation, she discovers that purpose is not only about what she does, it is about who she becomes. She becomes a woman who carries light into dark places, who speaks with authority born from healing, who influences not by force, but by presence. And slowly, she begins to sense that the world around her is responding to the shift within her, as if heaven is aligning her steps with something greater than she ever imagined. And as this unfolding continues, she begins to feel a new strength rising, preparing her for what comes next in this journey of remembering who she is in God. As purpose begins to awaken within her, God gently moves into deeper territories of her heart, touching places she learned to hide, even from herself. This is where emotional restoration begins, not in the loud and dramatic spaces of life, but in the quiet corners where old wounds still whisper. A woman who remembers who she is in God eventually faces the parts of her soul she once avoided, the disappointments she buried, the fears she disguised as strength, the memories she carried as if they were part of her identity. But in God's presence, these hidden places are not sources of shame. They become invitations for healing. Restoration does not always feel graceful. Sometimes it feels like being undone. She notices emotions rising that she thought had disappeared long ago. A sadness she never processed, a rejection she never named, a burden she carried so long that she learned to navigate life around it. Yet as God brings these things into the light, she begins to understand that healing is not a step backward, but a sacred progression deeper into wholeness. What she once called weakness is actually the doorway to strength. God begins revealing how certain fears shaped her decisions, how unspoken pain influenced the way she loved, trusted, and protected herself. She sees how her heart tightened around certain memories, not because she lacked faith, but because she lacked safety. And now, in His presence, she finally feels safe enough to loosen her grip. Healing becomes less about fixing what is broken and more about releasing what no longer serves her soul. Slowly, the heaviness she carried for years begins to dissolve. As her emotional landscape shifts, she becomes aware of patterns she once thought were personality traits, but were actually responses to survival. The hesitation she mistook for caution was rooted in past betrayal. The silence she called maturity was shaped by environments that dismissed her voice. The self-reliance she wore like armor developed in seasons when she felt she had no one else to depend on. But now, as God restores her, these patterns lose their authority. She begins choosing from truth instead of fear, from identity instead of insecurity. This restoration also strengthens her inner posture. She finds herself responding differently to challenges that once overwhelmed her. Peace arises more quickly. Discernment sharpens. Her emotional resilience grows, not because life becomes easier, but because her spirit is becoming anchored in truth rather than circumstance. She feels lighter, not because the world changed, but because something within her is being rebuilt with divine intention. And as this deep work continues, she begins to sense a new kind of strength forming within her, one that is quiet, steady, and rooted. A strength preparing her for the moment when she will rise not only healed, but empowered, stepping into the authority that has been waiting for her all along as the journey continues. As emotional restoration takes root within her, a new phase of awakening begins, one that is not only internal but unmistakably visible. When a woman remembers who she is in God, she begins to rise with a quiet authority that cannot be manufactured, imitated, or taken away. It is an authority born from alignment, from healing, from truth settling into places where insecurity once lived. Her steps become more intentional. Her voice carries a weight it never had before. She no longer moves through life hoping to be chosen. She moves knowing she already is. This authority is not loud or controlling. It is steady, grounded, and deeply spiritual. She realizes she no longer needs to explain herself to be understood or shrink herself to be accepted. She recognizes that her identity is anchored in God, and because of that, she is no longer swayed by the shifting opinions of others. Situations that once triggered fear now meet a woman who knows her value. Words that once wounded now fall powerless. The boundaries she used to feel guilty for setting now feel necessary and holy. People around her begin to notice the change, even if they cannot name it. There is something different in the way she carries herself, in the way she responds instead of reacts, in the way she refuses to settle for environments that diminish her. This is the spiritual authority of a woman who has returned to her identity. She becomes a mirror of God's strength in feminine form, soft yet unshakable, gentle yet discerning, humble yet deeply aware of the power she carries. She also begins to discern relationships through a new lens. Connections that once drained her no longer hold a place in her life. Conversations that once confused her now reveal their true intent. She is no longer pulled by emotional need, but guided by spiritual clarity. She recognizes when someone is aligned with her purpose and when someone is meant only for a season. This discernment is not a defensive wall, but a divine filter, allowing her to protect the space God is restoring within her. And as she walks in this renewed authority, she begins to understand that the strength she carries is not solely for her. It becomes a blessing for everyone connected to her journey. Her presence shifts atmospheres. Her words carry healing. Her faith inspires courage. Her identity becomes a living testimony of what God can rebuild in a heart willing to return to Him. If any part of this rise resonates with you, share in the comments what you are beginning to experience. Your reflection might speak directly to another woman who is just starting to remember who she is in God. As she begins walking in this renewed spiritual authority, the world around her starts to reflect the transformation taking place within her. A woman who remembers who she is in God does not simply feel different. She becomes different in ways that cannot be hidden. Her decisions shift toward alignment rather than approval. Her relationships deepen, not because she demands more, but because she finally understands what she deserves. Her standards rise effortlessly, guided not by pride, but by clarity. The version of herself she once struggled to protect now becomes the foundation from which she moves confidently into each day. This change often surprises her at first. She notices that situations which once unsettled her no longer carry the same weight. Conversations that used to drain her now reveal patterns she did not see before. She becomes aware of how much emotional and spiritual energy she used to give away without realizing its cost. With her identity restored, she begins honoring her capacity, her time, and her peace. She makes choices rooted in purpose, not pressure, and this shift in decision-making becomes a sign of her transformation, just as powerful as any outward action. Internally, she experiences a new sense of stability. Her thoughts no longer spiral the way they once did. Fear still knocks, but it no longer enters uninvited. doubt still whispers, but it no longer dictates her direction. She begins trusting her discernment because she recognizes the voice of God in her intuition. This trust becomes a compass, guiding her through moments of uncertainty with a calm she never had before. It is not that challenges disappear, it is that she now approaches them anchored instead of shaken. Externally, the evidence of her transformation appears in subtle shifts that accumulate over time. She speaks with more intention. Her posture carries confidence instead of exhaustion. She responds with wisdom instead of reaction. She walks into rooms aware of the light she brings, rather than questioning whether she belongs. Her presence becomes both peaceful and powerful, not because she forces it, but because her identity naturally radiates from a place of spiritual grounding. This new way of living also draws her closer to God in a more intimate, personal way. She no longer seeks him out of desperation or fear, but out of desire and alignment. Her prayers shift from requests for rescue to conversations of partnership. She begins to feel guided rather than lost, strengthened rather than overwhelmed. Every step she takes begins to reflect a woman who is not chasing identity, but living from it, not searching for validation, but walking in divine purpose. And as this transformation continues unfolding, she becomes increasingly aware that what God is awakening within her is preparing her for an even deeper strength, one that will reveal itself as the journey moves forward into the next stage of her spiritual identity. As her transformation matures, she begins to understand a truth that only spiritually awakened women come to recognize. Not every battle is hers to fight. There is a strength that rises when she remembers who she is in God, but there is an even deeper strength that rises when she remembers who God is for her. She learns that standing firm is sometimes more powerful than striving, and trusting God's movement is sometimes more transformative than forcing her own. This realization marks the beginning of a new season in her identity, one defined by quiet victory. She starts noticing that situations which once consumed her energy now lose their ability to destabilize her. Instead of reacting impulsively, she feels an unusual calm settling into her decisions. She begins to understand that peace itself is a form of spiritual authority. It is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of alignment. She no longer feels pressured to defend herself, explain her worth, or prove her intentions. Her confidence now comes from a deeper source, and, because of that, she walks with a kind of stability that confusion cannot penetrate. In this season, God often works behind the scenes more visibly than ever before. She begins to witness relationships shift, opportunities open, and obstacles dissolve without her having to force outcomes. What once felt like coincidence now feels intentional, as if God is rearranging pieces she could never move on her own. She sees closed doors not as punishment, but as protection. She senses that delays are not denials, but redirections. And the more she embraces this perspective, the lighter her spirit becomes. Her inner posture changes as well. She learns to wait without anxiety, to hope without desperation, to trust without demanding answers. This is not passivity, it is spiritual maturity. It is the peace of a woman who understands that God is not only aware of her needs, but actively involved in every detail of her life. This trust becomes her anchor, grounding her through circumstances that would have once broken her. Now, instead of collapsing under pressure, she grows stronger because she knows she is not standing alone. Even the way she interprets challenges begins to shift. Instead of asking why something is happening, she begins asking what it is shaping within her. Every trial becomes an opportunity for refinement. Every disappointment becomes a doorway to deeper faith. Every moment of uncertainty becomes a training ground for discernment. She realizes that spiritual identity is not formed in comfort, but in surrender, in letting God fight the battles she cannot see and orchestrate victories she could never achieve on her own. And as she continues to walk through life with this renewed confidence and trust, she becomes increasingly aware that God is preparing her for a final phase of awakening, one where restoration, purpose, and identity merge into a powerful fullness that will define the next chapter of her journey. As this journey reaches its deepest point, something extraordinary unfolds within her spirit. A woman who remembers who she is in God does not merely heal, rise, or overcome. She becomes whole. This wholeness is not about perfection, but alignment, a sacred harmony between identity, purpose, and trust. She begins to feel as though pieces of her life that once seemed scattered are now forming a clear, intentional picture. The woman she hoped to become, the woman she prayed to find, the woman she thought she lost along the way. They begin to merge into one undeniable truth. She is restored. This restoration is quiet yet powerful. She notices it in the way she thinks before she speaks, in the peace she feels before she reacts, in the confidence that moves through her without needing validation. She realizes she's no longer driven by fear, insecurity, or the pressure to prove her worth. Instead, her choices come from clarity. Her boundaries come from self-respect. Her direction comes from God. She is no longer shaped by her past, but strengthened by it, no longer pulled by what once hurt her, but guided by what now heals her. As she stands in this fullness, she begins to see why every season mattered. The heartbreak that once felt unbearable taught her resilience. The silence that once felt empty became the place where she finally heard God. The waiting that once frustrated her became the training that prepared her spirit. It all leads to this moment, a moment where she sees herself with the same strength, tenderness, and intention that God has always seen in her, and this awareness changes everything about how she moves into the future. She walks differently now, not because the path is easy, but because she knows who walks with her. She listens differently, not because life is quiet, but because she has learned to recognize God's voice even in the noise. She loves differently, not because she fears loss, but because she finally understands her worth. This is the woman God was shaping all along, a woman who carries restoration not as a memory of what she survived, but as a promise of what she is becoming. And as this chapter of awakening settles into her spirit, she senses that the journey is far from over. There is more to grow into, more to discover, more to walk out. And now she moves forward not with hesitation, but with expectation. What God has built within her is only the beginning of a far greater unfolding. If you felt this message in your spirit and walked with me until the end, leave a comment, saying something like, "This message was for me," or "I am walking in my identity." It helps me know you are here and growing through this journey. And if this content has been speaking to your heart, consider subscribing so you can continue receiving messages that strengthen your walk with God. Do not forget to leave a like if this touched you in any way. And if you want to go deeper, there is a video right here that continues this conversation beautifully. Just click and keep walking with me as we move forward together.